The wind had a way of cutting through the bones out in the Montana frontier, the kind of wind that carried both dust and secrets. Folks whispered about men who lived too long in the silence of the plains, how the loneliness carved their faces harder than any blade. Jacob Harlan was one of those men, 40 years old, shoulders wide, a face cut from the granite of the hills, and a voice almost never heard. They called him, the silent rancher, in town, a man whose only company were cattle, a horse named Ash, and a past no one dared pry into. For 12 years, he'd worked the same land alone, sleeping in a cabin built with his own calloused hands, waking to an empty table and the sound of coyotes howling in the black hours. Some said he chose it that way. Others whispered something had happened, something with a woman who never came back. Whatever it was, Jacob Harlan didn't speak of it. He didn't speak much at all. But loneliness has a way of gnawing at a man until he either breaks or does something desperate. That was why, one cold winter morning, a letter was penned in his name to an agency back east that matched lonely men with women willing to travel west and marry strangers. The letter was short, no flourishes, just practical words, a good woman to share work and life. Virgin bride preferred, must be willing to live hard, but fair. Signed, Jacob Harlan. Weeks later, when the snow began to melt and the earth smelled of damp pine, the stagecoach rolled into town carrying something Jacob hadn't expected. Not the young, hopeful virgin bride he'd ordered, but a woman whose eyes were red from tears, her dress plain, her face marked not with girlish innocence but with the weight of years. She stepped down from the coach clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and for a moment the crowd at the depot grew quiet. "Name's Clara," the driver muttered, handing her bag down. "Widow. Husband didn't make it through the fever. Said she had nowhere else to go." Clara lifted her chin, but her voice quivered when she asked, "Mr. Harlan?" Jacob stood there, arms crossed, hat low over his brow. He hadn't expected this. A widow. Not the untouched bride he had requested. She was not what he ordered, but she was what arrived. And for reasons he couldn't yet understand, he didn't walk away. The rancher's silence was heavy, and Clara, with tears still trembling on her lashes, mistook it for rejection. If you don't want me, I'll find another way." Her voice cracked, soft but steady, like a violin string pulled too tight. Jacob felt something shift inside him at that sound. He hadn't heard a voice in years that struck him like that. Something about her tone, fragile yet stubborn, cracked the walls he'd built around himself. He reached for her bag without a word, tossed it onto his wagon, and nodded toward the dirt road leading out of town. The ride to the ranch was long and quiet. Clara tried to speak once or twice, but Jacob's silence was impenetrable. She studied him, the hard line of his jaw, the way his eyes never lingered too long on her, the stiffness in his shoulders. He was a man closed off, a man who didn't just avoid words, but seemed afraid of them. The cabin loomed against the backdrop of rolling hills, sturdy but lonely, with a single lantern glowing in the window. Inside, it smelled of leather, wood smoke, and solitude. Jacob gestured for her to set her things down. She obeyed, standing awkwardly until he finally spoke his first word to her. "Eat." He set bread and stew on the table, his voice deep, rusty from disuse. Clara sat, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the spoon. When her tears began to fall silently into the stew, Jacob looked away, uncomfortable, yet something in his chest ached. That first night, they did not touch. Jacob lay awake listening to the sound of her breathing from the other side of the room. It was strange, after so many years of silence, to hear another human breathing under the same roof. Days turned to weeks. Clara was no fragile thing. She worked hard, her hands blistering as she hauled water, mended fences, and learned the rhythm of ranch life. She rarely cried after that first night, though sometimes Jacob would catch her staring at the horizon with a look of sorrow so deep it almost swallowed her. He wanted to ask about it, but the words always died in his throat. The silence between them was both a wall and a strange kind of comfort. But slowly, it began to break. One evening, Clara hummed softly while washing dishes. Jacob froze, listening. The tune was low and aching, a hymn maybe, or a lullaby. It filled the cabin in a way no sound ever had. When she noticed him watching, she blushed, drying her hands on her apron. "Sorry. Old habit. Don't stop," he said, his voice startling her. His words were rough but honest. "Sounds good." It was the first time he'd strung more than a single word together in weeks, and Clara's eyes softened. That night, she hummed again, and Jacob listened until sleep finally pulled him under. Over time, he learned fragments of her story. Her husband had been a preacher back east, kind but frail, taken by fever in the middle of winter. They had no children, though she had prayed for them. When he died, the church folk had offered pity but no home, and so she'd signed her name to the agency, hoping God still had some plan for her. "You wanted a virgin," she said one night, bitterness creeping into her tone. "And they sent me instead. A widow, used and weeping." Jacob had stared at her for a long moment before answering. "I wanted someone real." The words hung in the air like a confession. Clara's breath caught, and she saw then that Jacob's silence was not cruelty but fear. Fear of speaking the wrong thing, fear of the past he carried like a wound. It was another month before he told her anything of his own story. They were branding calves under the wide, unforgiving sun when he finally spoke. "Was married once," he said, his eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the iron. "She died in childbirth, both her and the baby. After that, I stopped talking. Didn't see the use." Clara's throat tightened. She reached out, her hand brushing his arm. He didn't pull away. In that touch, in that small gesture of understanding, something broke free inside Jacob Harlan. That night, he kissed her for the first time, hesitant, rough, as if he had forgotten how. Clara's tears fell again, but this time they weren't from sorrow. They were from the breaking of a silence too long endured. Their life together was not easy. The land was harsh, storms tore through the valley, cattle strayed, and hunger was a familiar visitor. But in the quiet of the cabin, Clara's voice began to fill the silence. Sometimes with stories, sometimes with songs, sometimes with simple words of comfort. And Jacob found himself speaking more, bit by bit, his voice unsteady but growing. The town still called him the silent rancher, but they noticed he came in more often now, with Clara at his side. They noticed how his eyes followed her, how he stood close as if she were his anchor. Years later, they would say that Clara saved him. But the truth was harsher and more beautiful than that. She did not save him, she broke him open. She made him remember the sound of life, the taste of hope, the ache of love after loss. And Jacob, the man who had ordered a virgin bride but received a widow instead, realized that sometimes the wrong answer is the only right one. On quiet nights, when the wind howled outside and the world felt empty again, Clara's voice would rise in song. And Jacob would listen, his hand wrapped around hers, his silence no longer a prison but a choice, because he had found a voice worth hearing. And for the first time in years, the lonely rancher was no longer alone.